Welcome in to Vol Basketball Fever, your number one source for discussions about the Vols and Lady Vols basketball programs. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video, and check in every week for new episodes of the show, video breakdowns, and more. Now, on with the episode. Hello everyone, and welcome in to another episode of Vol Basketball Fever. I am Nathanael Rutherford, joined again by Gene Henley. Glad to have you back again, Gene. Thank you all so much for tuning in to the show, whether you're watching it on YouTube or listening to it on the podcast. Thank you all so much. If you're on YouTube, give this video a like and share it around. Would very much appreciate that. And go ahead and subscribe to the channel as well. I know it's football time in Tennessee right now, or as we're recording this, Gene, it's 3 weeks away until the Vols kick off their 2022 season. But basketball's fairly close now. We're under 90 days. We're under 3 months away from the start of the men's basketball season, and for the Lady Vols too, their start of their season. So it's probably closer than a lot of people expect it to be. Under 3 months away now. Season tips off in early November for both squads. November 7th for the men's, and I think November 8th for the Lady Vols. The regular season does, because I think Lady Vols have an exhibition on October 30th or 31st. So I mean, I assume the men probably will too, that this wasn't on their schedule. We'll get to some of the schedule talk in a second, because it'll kind of fit into the overall theme of this episode, which is expectations. Gene, I mentioned at the end of the last episode that I wanted to wait and hold off and have another episode dedicated to this topic, because I thought we were already at that point. We'd recorded like almost, I think, an hour and a half at that point almost. And I thought, this would be better just to save it for a different episode. But I had the thought that, and I've had this thought before, but it really kind of crystallized, when you and I were talking near the end of the podcast. I don't remember why, but it popped in my head about expectations for Tennessee men's basketball program. I think it had to do with the fact we're talking about recruiting and stuff, and recruiting expectations and stuff. But I got to thinking, I thought about this before too, that there's an interesting generational divide, I think, between what the expectations are for Tennessee men's basketball program, depending on when you really first got into the program. If you were a Vol fan back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, watching Ray Mears, watching DeVoe, or if you were in the 90s and early 2000s, I mean, you probably didn't care a ton about Tennessee men's basketball at that time, because you had the likes of Wade Houston and Kevin O'Neal, and then Jerry Green, and then Buzz Peterson as Tennessee men's basketball head coaches, who most of those guys didn't have any success. Jerry Green had some success, but then he was only at Tennessee for 4 years and was not a very good cultural fit with the Vols either, and rubbed a lot of people the wrong way with his attitude and different things that he did. Again, won a lot of games. It was 89-36, and he got to the NCAA tournament every year he was there, and got to a Sweet 16. But aside from that, you had, again, Kevin O'Neal, Wade Houston, who is, I think, arguably has the worst record of any Tennessee head basketball coach, at least from the win percentage wise, of a guy who had been there for more than 3 years or so. And then again, Buzz Peterson, who was hired because he roomed with Michael Jordan, and basically, I mean, he did some other things at smaller schools, but was not a good hire for Tennessee. But then, if you were in those era, I think your expectations for Tennessee basketball are different. If you're an older fan, like I said, one who kind of grew up watching Tennessee basketball in the 60s, 70s, maybe someone like my dad, who was born in 63, which was Ray Mears' first year, he knew about Tennessee basketball in the time, around the time where you had the Ernie and Bernie show. Dad talks about, remembering watching the Ernie and Bernie show with Tennessee back in the 70s. And then, of course, you had, went from Ray Mears into DeVoe, who still had a successful career at Tennessee as a head coach. Your expectations, even then, though, the NCAA tournament was just different back then, for one. It didn't really become what it is now until the expansion to 64 teams in 1985. Before that, it wasn't even... I've heard a lot of people who are older fans say that it wasn't as nearly as big of a deal as it is now. In fact, the NIT was considered a bigger deal than the NCAA tournament was for in the early days of college basketball, especially like in the 40s and 50s and even earlier than that, I think, too. But I think those fans have a different, in most cases, again, I'm generalizing a little bit here, I think those fans have a different expectation for the men's basketball program at Tennessee than the people closer to my age who really got into Tennessee basketball because of the Bruce Pearl era. And I'm kind of a little bit before that, Gene. My first game was actually the Tennessee game that they upset Syracuse in the early 2000s. With I think Ron Slay got hurt in that game. Maybe he was already hurt or he got hurt in that game. But Yarbrough was on the team. Hayslip was on the team. Like I remember those guys, and that was my first game I ever went to for Tennessee men's basketball. So I watched. I started watching during the Buzz Peterson era. Basically, is kind of when I started watching and keeping up with Tennessee basketball. But I definitely get excited and rejuvenated, or I guess amped up more about Bruce Pearl when he was hired, and about Tennessee basketball because of Bruce Pearl. And I think younger me, my expectations are probably higher. But I think as I've gotten older and kind of learned more of the history of where Tennessee basketball, men's basketball has been in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of changed my expectations overall. But I still think that Bruce Pearl era definitely heightened it. And I think it's fair because that took Tennessee to new heights. And it wasn't, it's been shown that it wasn't just a flash in the pan of right place, right time until it all came crashing down. Because Rick Barnes has had success. He's taken Tennessee to multiple NCAA tournaments, got to the Sweet 16, won a share of an SEC regular season title, won an SEC tournament title. Heck, even Conzo Martin got Tennessee to a Sweet 16 in one of the 3 years that he was at Tennessee. But Jim, going all in all this is I think people who are kind of millennials, my age, kind of, just in that, I guess, late 20s, early 30s, maybe even younger than that, especially younger than that, I think, like the kids who are in college right now even, I think have a much different viewpoint on what their expectations for Tennessee basketball, because they've been more accustomed. Like they grew up watching Tennessee consistently get to the NCAA tournament. And for them, and a lot of fans, like, again, around my age, it's less. When Tennessee missed the NCAA tournament the first couple years of Conzo Martin, Donnie Tyndall, and the first couple years under Rick Barnes, those were almost, that was, I guess, anomalies maybe compared to what you got used to seeing with Bruce Pearl, and then now what you've also gotten used to seeing with Rick Barnes. So I think that the expectation conversation is interesting to me because you could almost tell the kind of age range of a person depending on what their expectations are for the men's basketball program, because I think, Gene, for me, well, I guess before I share mine, I'm curious your thoughts, because I'm coming at this obviously as more of a fan, as a kid who grew up in Knoxville, went to games, obviously attended the University of Tennessee, went to a lot of games as a student at Tennessee, covered Tennessee basketball for years, and as a media member, and obviously you did too, but you're not coming from it as a person who grew up in Knoxville and as a Tennessee fan. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts as an outsider, and also obviously a little bit older than me, someone who grew up with watching a different era of Tennessee basketball than I did. So before I kind of share mine, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on kind of what are your expectations of Tennessee basketball? What are you thinking should be fair expectations kind of year in and year out for the program, and maybe even on a national perspective? How do you think Tennessee is viewed nationally in college basketball?
So I don't think even where Tennessee is now, that the perception is what I would say Tennessee fans want it to be. Like, I think that they believe that this is like a top 5/10 program in the country, just based off the fact that their coach is paid that way, and that's not actually true. I think you could make a case for other leagues, for blue bloods. I mean, who has a better program, Tennessee or Gonzaga? I think the answer is pretty overwhelmingly Gonzaga. And I mean, let's save the arguments of, well, what would they do in the SEC? I mean, I get that. But the fact of the matter is, you can throw, like, what program is better, Tennessee or Michigan State? What program is better, Tennessee or Michigan? I'm not counting last season. I'm talking like the last 15 years. And I'm just kind of spitballing just teams that just pop up in my mind. And I say that to say that I think that Tennessee is a really good program. But where is it in the hierarchy? They've had they've had two good teams that really got onto the national spotlight. And that's two teams over the past like 12 years. If you want to go 15, I'd say there were probably three teams. There was that team that beat Memphis, become number one in the country. I guess that was what, 06, 07. I think that team lost to Ohio State in the Sweet 16.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall where that team that lost to Michigan State in the Elite Eight. I don't recall that team necessarily being considered a national championship contender. And at the end of the day, I'm looking at this from not where your season ended. Like, look, Tennessee got beat in the second round of the NCAA tournament last year, and I still think that they were one of the top five teams. I do. Like, that tournament can't be the overall determinant of what your program is. Like, you were the best team in one of the top 2 or 3 leagues in the country. I mean, the ACC got a bad rap last year. They showed it in March. The SEC was really good, and the Big Ten was really good. And so what I'm looking at and what I'm seeing is Tennessee was the best team in that league. And so I don't judge where, like, how good the team is. Like, a Final Four team is not automatically one of the top 4 teams in the country. BCU that year was not one of the top 4 teams. George Mason, Loyola Chicago, insert team here. Even, look, North Carolina was not one of the top 4 teams in the country last year. And they made it to the national championship game. Like, you have 35 games to figure this stuff out. I'm not going to judge you solely on 3 weeks in March. I understand that it's fun and it's fun to watch, but I'm saying that because I just don't remember where that team in 2009 or 2010, whatever it was. I don't remember where that team was. I don't remember that team necessarily being considered a top 5 team. I just feel like they made a run, and that's fine. But when we're talking about, like, where I look at this team, I mean, again, I look at this program, like, my history with this program goes back probably, 35 years as a casual observer, just because my dad's side of the family is from Knoxville, and half of that family, or most of that family is Tennessee fans. So I remember Allen Houston's. I saw the Kevin O'Neill era up close, because he recruited 2 of my teammates. He recruited one, Tennessee, and our team went up there and watched the practice and all this, that, and the other. I was around the Jerry Green program, because 2 of my teammates were at Tennessee. The Pearl era looked fun. And it was weird just because it goes against everything that I ever knew Tennessee basketball to be. And look, I understand people are going to get mad when I say this, but it's just there is a correlation between Tennessee basketball and Kentucky. It just is. Like, at the end of the day, like, Tennessee is 1 9 or 10 win season away from just looking at this and just being like, oh, wow, we're back. Just 1. Like, it's not even, and I'm not even saying it like this. All it's going to take is 1 victory on, I guess it's still the 3rd Saturday in October.
Yeah.
It's going to take 1 win there. 1 win over Georgia. And everybody's going to be bought back. Everybody is. And that's look, there's enough bandwidth for people to love both sports. At the end of the day, people look at your school as one of the top 10 to 15, college football programs in the country, even with the past 15 years. They still say they treat Tennessee football like Miami, where it's like, man, if they get the right coach, I'm telling you what, Better watch out. I'm telling you that because people will come to that school. Whereas, Tennessee basketball is still, you'll get some guys, obviously. They're getting guys now,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll continue to get guys. But the expectations outside of Knoxville nationally aren't going to be. Look, if Rick Barnes has a bad year, people aren't going to be like, "Oh, is it time to make a change?"
Right.
Where like Calipari and where Coach K was at the end, where Roy Williams was at the end. Like, I think that Tennessee has always been a good program. They've had too many highs and lows to be considered historically a great one. I mean, and even if you take out history and you just want to put the last 25 years in there, way too many ebbs and flows for you to be like, oh man, this is it. Yeah, this is what we are. And unfortunately, that's what you're going to be judged by. Your recent history suggests that you're not quite there, and that you're one bad coaching hire away from going back to being essentially Ole Miss or somebody like that, where
Mm-hmm.
you're just in the long line of just programs that just ebb and flow. And the SEC will always be considered like Kentucky, Arkansas. I don't know. I mean, you and I talked to the SEC podcast. Who's the second best program in SEC history? And there's no clear consensus.
No.
I mean, I guess it's probably Arkansas because they got a chip. Florida had that nice little run, but it was a run. Heck, Mike White ran out the back door last year, and so it's like you may have a bad year every so often. I mean, Arkansas is not, but I would say that probably the second best program in the SEC is Arkansas. You can make an argument for Kentucky being third. I'm sorry for Tennessee being third, but you can make that same argument for 5 of the programs. And so, like Barnes just has to keep on doing what he's doing, and maybe it comes down to making a run. Because I don't judge you on that stuff, but I understand the fan base is going to be like, look, you're doing too many things recruiting wise for us to be like, to go out in the second round.
Yeah.
So if he gets one of these runs before he's done, and I think he deserves it. I always say good people deserve things like that. That guy deserves to be the person to kind of flip this thing around and get this program to an Elite Eight. Will he? I can't answer that. I'm just saying, like, if you keep doing things the right way, eventually you'll get the result. I think he'll be that guy ultimately to maybe raise the expectations going forward for the next person.
You made a couple of really good points there that I want to get back to, but also want to go back to, you were talking about that 09-10 team that made the Elite Eight run. It was an interesting team. They started out preseason number 10 in the country, kind of fluctuated a little bit, stayed around 10, 9, 11, up until late December when they got absolutely just beat down by USC, 77-55, and then dropped into kind of the teens area, rose back up to number 8 in the country before falling pretty far and dropping down to 20th is the lowest they got when it came out in mid-February because they had dropped several different games in a row almost. They lost to Vanderbilt twice that season, and they got beat by Kentucky, and that's what dropped them down to 20th. But then they finished the regular season AP poll 15th, got to the SEC tournament, and then played Kentucky, I think, in the finals of that one. And the guy just ran out of the gym 74-45 in that game. But that was a team that was, I mean, they fluctuated, but they did not drop out of the poll all season. But I think you're right. I don't think they're ever considered a national championship contender, but they were a preseason top 10 team and kind of stayed around that 15-ish mark for most of the year, kind of, in the lower teens, kind of in the teens area between 20 and 10. They stayed in that entire range the entire year. So they were one of the rare Tennessee teams that actually started. You went wire to wire in the AP poll, which didn't happen very often before Bruce Pearl, but it has now happened, I think, a couple times under Rick Barnes. So I just want to throw it there because you'd asked that, and I thought that was an interesting kind of note. I'd forgotten that team started out as a preseason top 10 team, and then had some pretty good wins, but also had some. That was a team that, aside from that Kansas win against, number one Kansas, obviously one of the bigger wins in Tennessee men's basketball history, that after you had that, all the arrests and stuff that happened that same week, and then Tennessee goes out and upsets Kansas, you lost to a then number 6 Purdue team at a neutral site, 73-72. You got shellacked by USC. You go on and beat number 21 Ole Miss, which I forgot they were ranked at that time, in overtime, 71-69, and at home. But then you lose to Vanderbilt, who was number 21 at the time. Lose to Vanderbilt again, because a couple weeks later, who was number 22, and then followed it up with that same week by losing to number 3 Kentucky. Then you come back and beat number 2 Kentucky at home on February 27th. But then, like I said, that a lot of the big games that year, Tennessee lost. They had that number 1 team that they beat Kansas, which that was obviously, I think, the defining win of that season, besides beating Ohio State in the NCAA tournament. But a lot of the times that team didn't play super well in big games or against the higher tier opponents. So that was just an interesting team. I think you're right. They never were considered a title contender, but they weren't, like you said. I think you said it right. They were a good, solid team that year that made a run. They had the makeup to make a run. So I think that was just interesting. I kind of hadn't really looked at that season as a whole in a while. I'd more kind of focused on that Kansas game and the Elite Eight run. I hadn't really looked at it as a whole in a while. But you said several things there that made me think, and points I was already going to bring up, but I think fit into this conversation even better now, going and looking at the last 25 years of Tennessee basketball. And the thing that stands out to me most about the last 25, 30 years of men's basketball at Tennessee is inconsistency. And you and I have talked about this on the show before, Gene, about the fact that it's really, I think, a testament to the potential of the Tennessee basketball program that you've had so many different coaches, and just from 2000 onward, and Tennessee has still made several Sweet 16 runs. Jerry Green got him there. Bruce Pearl got him there a couple times. Conzo Martin got them there. Rick Barnes has gotten them there. Like, that's 4 different coaches who've gotten Tennessee to the Sweet 16 in just the last 22 years. Like, that's kind of remarkable that you think about it. Again, that's not like a super, super deep runs, but just the fact that Tennessee's had as many head coaches as they've had in the last 22 years or so, that you've had Rick Barnes, Donnie Tyndall, Conzo Martin, Bruce Pearl, Buzz Peterson, Jerry Green, Kevin O'Neill, and Wade Houston, all since 1990. That's 8 different head coaches in the past 32 years. That's barely an average of, it's exactly an average of 4 years per head coach. That's not how you build success especially at a high tier program. You look at the Blue Bloods, Gene, I think you can back me up on this too, and anyone listening, you can look at them. Don't have the numbers pulled in front of me. But the vast majority of the teams you consider Blue Bloods are kind of the top programs in college basketball. At some point or another, they had coaches who were there for a long time, or multiple coaches. Tennessee had that kind of early, in the 60s and 70s with Mears and DeVoe, who were there for a combined almost 20 years, or almost 30 years combined. Mears was there 15 years, who's the longest tenured head coach at Tennessee, and then DeVoe was there for 11. So a combined 26 years of head coaches that were, I think you had one in between there with, I think Cliff Wettig maybe was the guy. Yeah, Cliff Wettig had a season in between after Mears' health issues and stuff. And essentially, you had 2 head coaches for 26 seasons. And then now in the past 32, Tennessee's had 8. So that's kind of like, football, the same thing. You had 2 head coaches for the longest time with Johnny Majors and Philip Fulmer. And then now you've had Lane Kiffin, Derek Dooley, Jeremy Pruitt, or I guess Butch Jones, I've skipped over him. Butch Jones, Jeremy Pruitt, and now Josh Heupel, all in the last, 15 years. So you need to have consistency. All the Blue Bloods have had guys who were there longer. Look at Kansas, the Bill Self. Look at, obviously, Kentucky now with John Calipari, but also they had Rupp for the longest time there with them too. You look at North Carolina with Dean Smith, with Roy Williams. They've had a couple guys there. Duke with Coach K. Louisville had, what's his face? I almost said Bobby Petrino. Golly. They're, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, they had a couple guys who've been there for a long time and had success there. So, I don't know that people will consider Louisville a blue blood, but they're still a very good program. They're better than Tennessee overall on the men's basketball side. And of course, clearly UCLA, John Wooden. So I mean, you look at the programs that are considered some of the best, and even now some of the teams that are consistently very good and consistently make deeper NCAA tournament runs. Gonzaga and Villanova, their head coaches have been there for a long time. Jay Wright was there for a very long time. Mark Few, very long time. Like, that's consistency. That's what building consistency does. Tennessee has never had a consistency in the men's basketball program in the last 30, almost 40 years at this point, it feels like. Rick Barnes, Gene, I was looking at it beforehand. I was writing stuff down before I realized that it was actually just right in front of me on Sports Reference. It was easier to find than me going through Tennessee's media guide and writing it down. But I mentioned it. Ray Mears, Tennessee's longest tenured head coach, 15 years. Emmett Lowry, back in the 40s and 50s, second longest, 12 years. Don DeVoe in the 70s and 80s, 11 years. W.H. Britton in the 20s and 30s was there for 9 seasons. John Maurer, 8 seasons, and now Rick Barnes is entering his 8th season. So he's tied as the 5th longest tenured head coach in Tennessee men's basketball history, and he's only been there 8 years. Or this will be his 8th year, I guess. And he ranks 4th in victories. He's got 150. You've got Mears, who is going to be very hard to catch, 278. Don DeVoe, 204. And then Emmett Lowry, who I mentioned, at 169. And then now Barnes, 150. That's been, I think, the biggest detriment for Tennessee has been the inconsistency. And the fact that I think this is, I almost want to call this Rick Barnes era the establishment area, the establishing era. Because you mentioned too, Gene, if Arkansas had been able to build off what they did in the 90s and maintained their success, they would be the clear-cut number 2 to me. Or Florida, for example. If Florida was able to build after what Billy Donovan did, and if Mike White or they hired someone else besides Mike White, and they were able to continue the success that Billy Donovan had, they would be the clear-cut number 2. If Arkansas could build off what they did in the 90s and into the 2000s better than what they did, they'd be the clear-cut number 2. The SEC's had a consistency problem with every single program that isn't Kentucky. Kentucky's had the most success because they've been the most consistent basketball program on the good side, because there's been plenty of teams who've been consistently bad over the last decades or so. But on the good end of things, Kentucky's had the most success in large part because they've been the most consistent and have made the best hires and put the most money, most resources and stuff into their programs, their program as well. But this has the chance to be the establishing era for Tennessee, where Barnes and his crew and everything have laid the foundation for Tennessee basketball after it had been laid by Bruce Pearl and then promptly jackhammered, and then needed repairing after he left, and then after Conzo left after 3 years, and then the hiring of Donnie Tyndall. The foundation was there under Pearl. It was kind of shaky as it was because of kind of how Pearl was operating, and then he lied to the NCAA, and then everything fell apart pretty quickly. Mears and DeVoe did a great job, and then you can see how quickly it can just evaporate for you in any sport, but I think especially in basketball, how quickly you can just go from being a program that is well respected, is making consistent runs, to all of a sudden you're falling off a cliff and you're done. There's a couple teams. There's a team that came to my mind when I said that earlier. A team I remember, well, Texas, for example, under Rick Barnes. I mean, they were a team that was consistently making the tournament and making pretty deep runs, and then it got to where he could not get out of the second round, and then after Barnes left, they've had almost no success in the tournament, but also a lot of missed opportunities regular season and in the Big 12 in general too. Because I know you said you don't want to just judge the program off what you do in March. That's just kind of the easiest barometer to throw out there. But I think for me, and how I'm looking at the Rick Barnes era, is that it's a chance to establish something Tennessee hasn't had in a very long time, and that's consistency. After Barnes leaves, that next hire is extremely important, because to me, it's got to be another person who's going to be here another 10, 15 years. You can't go back after Barnes is gone. He'll probably have been at Tennessee for a decade by the time he leaves, or over a decade by the time he leaves, and end up being possibly the second most tenured head coach in Tennessee men's basketball history, or experienced, wherever the word looking for is. You can't, to me, I don't think you can go and hire someone who's just going to be here for 3 or 4 years and then be gone. Even if they have a lot of success, I think it's harder to keep having that revolving door and keep having success. Because I think it's going to be interesting to see, for Duke and North Carolina, how long do their new hires stay, and what do they do? Because it's different for them, because they're they basically hired within. They hired guys who is a North Carolina guy, who is a Duke guy. They hired guys that are, I don't imagine will leave for another program because that is their dream job. That is where they played and where they, they bleed Tar Heel blue or bleed Devil blue. So maybe Tennessee goes and hire. That's the other problem though. Tennessee doesn't have a former player who's coaching at a high level or anything like that right now either. So that's kind of a future conversation. But I think to me right now, I think this is the time Tennessee needs to have the foundation set for the future. And I think my expectations for, like you said right now, Tennessee, I think historically, I guess maybe looking at the past 25, 30 years, Gene, I think you're right. I don't know that we should go back too far. But a lot of people unfortunately don't care a ton about what happened before the 90s, for example, in men's basketball. But you look at the last 25 years or so, and basically since the 2000s or late 90s on, Tennessee's probably they're the top 20, a top 45 program for sure. Maybe argue top 30 program because you've had Elite Eight, you've had several Sweet 16s, you've had guys getting drafted into the NBA, guys who were All-Americans in college. You've had some success. You've had not in national championships. You've had a few regular season titles. You've had now a tournament title finally for the first time since in 42, 43 years. I don't know that you can say they're a top 25 team over the last 25 years though, but I think you could say top 35 and maybe top 30, but they're definitely, to me, not, I don't think a top 25 team, because you were mentioning, how would Tennessee compare to Michigan or Michigan State. The other team I thought of when you said that was how would Tennessee compare to Purdue? Because that's a team that Tennessee, for one, has been matched up with a lot in men's basketball, but for two, I think it's an interesting comparison. Just looking at postseason stuff for them, they've made the NCAA tournament a lot now, especially under what's his face, the current head coach over there for them, Matt Painter, who's now in his 17th season. Talk about consistency, 17th season with Purdue. But they've not made, their last Final Four was in 1980. And again, that was before the full expansion to 64 teams in 85. So, yes, they've made a couple Final Fours, but they were in 1969 and 1980. So they've been over 40-something years ago. They have made a couple Elite Eights. They made it, of course, 2019 when they beat Tennessee, 2000, 94, and, of course, 80 and 69 as well. In fact, they were the NCAA tournament runner-up in 1969. They've made several Sweet 16s in 22 and 19, 18, 17, 2010, 2009, and 2000. But again, in that same time frame, Tennessee's made as bad as many Sweet 16s as Purdue has in that same time frame. Purdue's just been able to make one more Elite Eight in that same time frame. Again, they made it in 2000 and made it in 2019. Tennessee made it once in that same 2000 to 2022 time frame. I think Purdue is a pretty fair comparison to Tennessee and men's basketball over the last 25 years, Gina, unless I'm forgetting something for something they've done that I'm forgetting about, but they haven't won a ton of conference tournaments. They haven't won or conference tournament championships. They've won, let's see, they won a regular season title in 1917 and 2010. And the last one before that was 1996. And they won the conference tournament in 2009. So they have as many conference tournament titles in the last 25 years as Tennessee, and probably about the same amount of regular season titles. Tennessee's won at least 2 in the last 25 years, and I think they've won a third, maybe even a fourth in that same time period. I have the wiki pulled up. Let me look. Tennessee won at least a share of the regular season title in 2018, 2008, and 2000. So yeah, they have the exact same number of regular season conference titles, conference tournament titles, and Tennessee has made the Sweet 16 in 2000, 2007, 2008, 2010, 14, and 19, which is 6 times. And Purdue has made it in 2000, 2009, 2010, 17, 18, 19, 22. So one more time than Tennessee. Again, everything notwithstanding, the tournaments and stuff like that are not the ultimate barometer, but it is an easy way to kind of look at it. I think Tennessee and Purdue are pretty comparable, and I don't know if I would say Purdue's been a top 25 men's basketball program over the last 25 years. Because, taking the orange sunglasses off and, people will say, well, yeah, of course Tennessee is because you're a Tennessee fan. Would you say Purdue is a top 25 program in the last 25 years, Gene? Because I don't. Maybe. Again, I would say Tennessee is a top 35, maybe top 30, and that's about where I would put Purdue. I mean, they've not made enough waves for me to say that they are for sure a top 25 team, in the last 2-3 decades or so.
It's tough because the half of the ACC has won a national championship in the last 25 years.
Phew. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's high, but Duke, Carolina, Virginia, Syracuse, Louisville. All right, so just five of them. But still,
Still.
yeah, five different teams have won at least one national championship in that time. I think Carolina maybe won two. Um, I mean, just two SEC teams have won in that time span, Kentucky and Florida.
Hmm.
Um, I'm just trying to think of teams. Big 12, Kansas, uh, Baylor. Uh, that's
Who beat Texas Tech? Was that Virginia?
yeah, that was Virginia.
Okay. Sorry,
Um, Villanova's got two chips. So, like, if you just look from and like this kind of, I'm not trying to be like hypocritical in my earlier argument. I just don't think that your tournament success should be the end all be all.
yeah, right.
I just don't, because it's one game and it's not the true determinant of who the best team is. It's just a measurement that makes a lot of people a lot of money. And that's basically what it boils down to. It's a measurement. And it's just the best measurement for college basketball. But yeah, I mean, like I said, Purdue's been a good program. I mean, Tennessee's been a good program. Purdue's probably has some lean years. Tennessee's has some lean years. Tennessee is right now under the longest tenure coach they've had in quite some time. And I'm not sure what that necessarily turns into. It's turned into a certain level of success. I think he averages like 22 wins a season, somewhere along those lines, or, which you would almost think that he would average more. But I thought I just pulled it up a second ago. I think Rick Barnes is averaging like 23 wins a year in Tennessee. And, 150 wins instead, so 22.
Mm-hmm.
So 22 wins a season. COVID season, they won 18. I mean, like he's made this program relevant in a way that it hadn't been in quite some time. And like I said, when we have this discussion, I don't know what the end game is for what all this is going to, because there's nothing tangible to really base this on, which has always just been on. That one team was a moment in time.
Yep.
That was a moment in time, and it was a fun moment, and a lot of people enjoyed it. A lot of people had fun with it. Number one in the country. Emotional senior day, emotional end of the season that year when they got beat by Purdue, like emotions. And since then, it's just kind of been excitement, but not emotion. And when you look around the country and you have these teams, like, look, some of them are just, hired guns, like that Baylor team that blew up Gonzaga a couple years ago. That was kind of just like a hired gun sort of team. Like, I get it. There were probably some, people around Baylor that were really happy, really excited about everything that transpired. But it didn't feel like it was one of those just like organic teams. I don't remember who won the championship. Oh, Kansas. That felt organic. And so, like I said, and I always go back to this sort of discussion because I think it's relevant to everything that we've talked about, everything that we've always talked about with this. Like, we can talk about all the stars and recruiting rankings, but the reason why Tennessee is relevant is because of those guys like Admiral, Grant, and really Admiral and Grant. Everything else just filtered around them. Fulkerson, Kyle Alexander, Jordan Bone, Lamonte Turner, all that stuff. Jordan Bowden, like all that feel good filtered around those two guys. Those are the two guys who are always front and center. Those are the two guys who were getting, when they were number one in the country, getting the CBS hits, the ESPN hits. They were the two. They were the two who always seemed to have to answer when something wasn't going well. And so, like, everything filters around that. And it's not that now. And I don't know. And look, that doesn't mean that it can't be successful, because look at them.
Mm-hmm.
Look at them last year. I mean, look, they were to the point where there was a discussion of should they be a 2 seed in the tournament. They ended up being a 3. And that was a team that a lot of people suggested could win a championship. A lot of people suggested that. They could compete for a championship. And maybe there was some truth to that. It didn't work out, but they were a really good team. Now, what are they going to be this year? Can they build on it? Until they're consistently winning 25 games under different groups of people, they're not where you want them to be. Because, like, it's all fun to do, to have this sort of run under that initial group of guys, Grant Admiral, so on and so forth. But you have to remain that's the true determinant of a great program. Gonzaga's always going to be in the mix. Carolina will have a bad year, but they always seem to be in the mix. Duke, same thing. Kentucky, take out that 1 year. Look, Kentucky was one of the top probably 5-10 teams in the country. And that they could shoot it, which I thought would be an issue. And sure enough, somebody exploited that. They didn't get out the first round of the tournament last year. But you're going to be judged accordingly. When you're consistently winning 25 games or so and doing it under different groups of guys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You just did it last year with, right now your core you've got that core again. You've got, you've got Vescovi and you've got Josiah. That's the core. Apologies to Euro-Ocean guys like that. Your core is Vescovi and James. Because they were there that first year. The year afterwards. The year after the run. And so, if they just simply keep this thing going, they just simply can set this thing up for the next group of guys. The BJ Edwards of the world. That'll be the true determinant of how good this program is going to be. Because if it falls apart just because 1 or 2 people leave, the program's not what you want it to be. If it falls apart the first time that somebody graduates or somebody transfers or somebody goes to the draft, you've kind of been able to hold on to a little bit of Grand Admiral because Fulkerson had that run in February of 2020 to where people believed, they got excited, they beat Kentucky, Eves, guys like that. But now that's officially over. Now you've got Vescovi and Josiah. Who's going to carry that torch on to the next group of guys? And if you don't have that, then at the end of the day, you don't have a program. You got teams. And I personally think there's just a huge difference there between programs and teams. Kentucky has teams. I understand Calipari is the program. But Kentucky has teams. Who would you rather be right now in terms of a fan base? Tennessee or Kentucky? Because at least Tennessee has some people that you can kind of latch on to. Kentucky doesn't have that. I said I have just as many Kentucky ties as I do Tennessee ties. I talk to those people. I know, man, they're frustrated. Fans, true fans are just always just like, what are we getting excited for? The next crop of people who's going to leave it. And there's just something to be said for that. I understand, Kentucky serves a purpose. It may not be about winning championships, or right now Calipari's got his own issues because he and Stoops apparently are going back and forth. Although I think that's in Knoxville, there's still a chance there a moment in time because the SEC in football is not getting any weaker anytime soon. So it's Tennessee at this point. This may be an 8-win team that sneaks up and wins 9 or 10 one year. But I feel like they're going to end up being just like an 8-win team. But if they can maybe sneak into that 3 spot in the SEC with as talented as the SEC is right now, like 3 spot all time, not just like for a week or so, not just for a year. If they can just sneak into that 3 spot of like third best program in the league, that's huge, man. That's huge because that just means that the 2 teams that are ahead of you are Kentucky and Arkansas. And guess what? Those expectations will follow you every single year. Or just pencil Tennessee in as a top 10. Just toss them somewhere. I don't know where, but we'll put them at 9. Who cares? Put them at 9 and be done with it. Put them at 6. Who cares? Put them at 10. All right, well, they lost 8 seniors or they lost 6 guys to the draft, 6 first-round picks or whatever. We'll still slot them in at 11. Just because they've earned that respect nationally with us. They're not there yet. Like, can they? Who knows? But they're not. They're still not there yet. There's still not enough people who see Tennessee and just like, this moves the needle. 2 teams move the needle in the SEC and the Kentucky. Tennessee's not quite there yet. Because when Arkansas is good, I mean, we saw the SEC standings last year.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Auburn. Like, and just check. I mean, we could check the numbers and all this, that, and the other. Like, Kentucky's always going to move the needle more than anybody else. It's what it is. Everybody in the SEC will rejoice when Kentucky loses. They just will. I think Tennessee actually may be second in that regard, because when they're good, Tennessee fans are a lot to deal with.
Yeah.
But I can say the same thing about Arkansas, because I'm pretty sure I saw them on social media a lot last year when they were good and they were peacocking a lot. But yeah, like can Tennessee just become a program where you constantly recruit people to your program and it doesn't matter who the faces are? You can pencil them in for 25 wins, which is, look, tough in this league. I understand it's a difficult ask. But I could make an argument that the ACC is just as hard, if not harder. And last season, 6 teams won at least 20 games.
Wow.
7, 8. Like this, like it's a tough ask to say, hey, every season win 25.
Yeah.
Just be expected to win 25. And if they can do that, I mean, they've won. Then this program 1,000% has an option.
Yeah, no, and what you said about getting, guys, different guys in every year or every 2 or 3 years, basically, and having, still getting into that 22, 25 win mark. Like that's the goal. Like that's what you want as a program. Like that's not, that's not. I don't know. I think that's what Tennessee's trying to do, and that's what Tennessee has struggled to do. Year in and year out. You're talking about getting 25 wins in a season. Tennessee, the program, has only done that 5 times or no, 6 times. Gene, they've only won 25 or more games. I mean, you can say 24. That's pretty close. But if you want to say 24 wins, Tennessee as a program has only done that 8 times in school history, and 3 of those times have been under Rick Barnes. In fact, 3 of the times Tennessee has won 26 or more games has been under Rick Barnes, and Bruce Pearl has the other 2. So Tennessee won 31 under Barnes, 31 under Pearl, 28 under Pearl for the team that made the Elite 8, and then 27 under Barnes last year, and then 26 under Barnes, of course, the year they won the regular season SEC title, and then 26 under Jerry Green. That's just kind of funny. I think kind of where I want to end this part of the podcast, this conversation, and before we move on to the last bit as we close the episode too, is we're talking about historical perspective, and you mentioned Tennessee football, and if they even just get 9 wins, and like you said, beat a Georgia, a Florida, an Alabama, it's the conversation like with Texas. Like, is Texas back? Is Tennessee back? Because they have that history of being a program that deserves that respect historically. In football, if you take out the Ivy League schools and stuff like that, because now they're not really Division I, they haven't been for a long time. If you take the Ivy League schools out of it, Tennessee is tied right now with USC for the 10th most wins in college football. Still, even with the last 15 years of I guess just mediocrity basically for Tennessee in football, they're still top 10 in most wins. You have Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, Texas, Penn State, Nebraska. I guess technically tied for 8th or 9th actually. Maybe I did the math wrong. But Tennessee, and regardless, Tennessee and USC both have 856 wins, and both inside the top 10 for wins all time in football. So Tennessee all time win rate, that's not including, it's not just like you said, not just looking at what you do in the postseason, how many national titles, how many bowl games, all different stuff, just purely just based off wins. Tennessee as a football program is still top 10 all time. On the men's basketball side of things, Gene, got to scroll all the way down here. Tennessee on men's basketball ranks 38th in all-time wins. So again, top 40 program, not bad, but you're actually behind even a program like Alabama when it comes to wins in men's basketball. You're right behind you. Tennessee and Iowa are neck and neck. Tennessee has 1,717 total wins in school history. Iowa has 1,719, and Tennessee's actually played 8 less seasons than Iowa, so they have a better winning percentage than Iowa does. But Tennessee's right behind a school like Bradley and Missouri State, which it's a little different with men's basketball. They don't have it quite as delineated by power conferences, I guess, as football does. But I thought that was interesting to me that Tennessee, top 40 program, they're 38th in all-time wins. But again, that's a much different. And no one has said that Tennessee football and basketball are comparable. I just thought I didn't realize Tennessee was still that low in wins all time in men's basketball. All time, I mentioned last 25 years or so, Tennessee and Purdue I think are equal. All time, they're not even close. Purdue is a top 15 team when it comes to wins total. They're number 12 in men's basketball and wins. It's a lot of that because you look at what Gene Keady did. Keady, whatever how you say his last name, was there for a long time with Purdue and had a lot of success. And of course, Purdue seemed like they were much better in the 60s, 70s, and 80s back in the day too. But yeah, I just wanted to leave off of that. I thought that was interesting. Tennessee 10th in football, or tied in the top 10 in football still, taking out the Ivy League schools for wins. And Tennessee men's basketball is in the top 40, kind of borderline top 35. So just thought that was interesting. Of course, Lady Vols, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I bet if they're not number 1, they're in the top 3. Probably, I would bet top 5 for sure. So just thought that was kind of a little interesting, kind of historical note. But we got to move on here to the last topic because we've already talked about that topic for quite a bit. But to the expectations pitch still, or kind of, I guess, topic of this, Gene, is looking at this upcoming season and kind of what our expectations of this team. We'll obviously dive more into that as we get closer to the season. We are less than 3 months away now. But Tennessee did release their full non-conference schedule. We don't technically know all the teams yet because you have the battle for Atlantis, and Tennessee knows one opponent for sure. They'll play a second game, but they also could have a third game in that tournament. Right now, Gene, Tennessee, the regular season starts November 7th against Tennessee Tech at home. Next game is on the road. Technically, it's a neutral site game, in Nashville against Colorado. What a neutral site game. It's going to be a home game for Tennessee. In Nashville against Colorado on November 13th. You're at home against Florida Gulf Coast, formerly known as Dunk City, on November 16th. And then you go to the Bahamas for the Battle for Atlantis, where you'll take on Butler. And then you'll play either USC or BYU in the next game. And then you have the chance again, if you've won out and make it to the final, to play a third game in the Battle for Atlantis. And that would be kind of late November, I think, or right around Thanksgiving. You come back to Knoxville on November 30th and play McNeese State. You host Alcorn State. You host Eastern Kentucky. You have neutral site game in the Hall of Fame game invitational in Brooklyn against Maryland. Go on the road at Arizona on December 17th. Host Austin Peay, and then obviously enter into SEC play shortly after that. And then in the middle of all that, though, in the SEC Big 12 Challenge, you have Tennessee hosting Texas. The first thing that stood out to me about that, Gene, was the home slate. Not very good. Tennessee Tech, Florida Gulf Coast, McNeese State, Alcorn State, Eastern Kentucky, Austin Peay, and then Texas. That's like Texas is the only one. All of Tennessee's big games this year outside of conference play are going to be on the road or neutral site. In Nashville against Colorado, so that's not too far at least. It's not in Thompson Bowling, but there's a lot of Vol fans in Nashville, and it's not too far of a trip for people in Knoxville who do want to go see them play in Bridgestone against Colorado. But then you go over to the Bahamas for the Battle for Atlantis, and then you go up to Brooklyn, New York for a game against Maryland in December, and then you also go way out to Arizona, Tucson, Arizona, to play the Wildcats. But the second thing that popped in my head was that this isn't the toughest non-conference schedule Tennessee's ever had, but it's still not an easy one. I mean, it's still not. It's not as tough as you've seen it in a couple years, really most of the Rick Barnes era, I feel like. But it's not easy. There are games there that in the Battle for Atlantis, I think Tennessee should beat Butler, but either USC or BYU is going to be a very interesting non-conference matchup for Tennessee, or a neutral site matchup for Tennessee there. Colorado is going to be an interesting one because, again, it's a neutral site, but it's kind of a home game against Colorado. Maryland and Brooklyn and the Hall of Fame Invitational, that one's intriguing to me. And then, of course, Arizona. That was a extremely fun game last year in Knoxville. We'll be very intrigued to see what Arizona is like in mid-December this year. They will probably be pretty good again. And then Texas is considered right now a top 10 preseason team. We'll see kind of where I think they are still. I know the women's team is. I think the men's team is too. We'll see kind of where they end up, but they're considered still a pretty very solid team, and won't get to see Tennessee play them until late January, in the SEC Big 12 Challenge. But Gina, I look at that non-conference slate, and it's right now we know 12 of the games will there may be a 13th one depending on what happens in the Battle for Atlantis. I feel pretty solid about that being a 10-2 record for Tennessee. And this is without really diving into any of these teams and knowing a whole lot about, especially a lot of the smaller schools. But I know a little bit about Butler because I follow a guy who covers Butler. I don't even remember how I started following him, but I've been following him for several years now, and he covers Butler. So I know a little bit about them. They're considered okay. They're kind of a borderline top 100 kind of Ken Palm team. Tennessee should win that one, but USC and BYU, I think, are both top 75, top 60 teams, so that would be a test. And I don't remember who else is in the Battle for Atlantis, but it's a pretty good set of schools in there. Arizona is going to be the toughest test, I think, besides Texas. Those two are the ones that I look at as potential losses because Arizona is on the road. They should be very good still. And then Texas is supposed to be, again, very solid team. And Tennessee had, lost him this past year. We'll see what happens when it's in Knoxville, but that's not it's some good tests. It'll be good. Build up your net, your RPI, whatever you want to call it now, for Tennessee. But Gene, I think that's about as favorable of a non-conference schedule as Tennessee's had in a while. Maybe one of the smaller schools is going to be better than I'm expecting, but Tennessee shouldn't lose to a McNeese State or an Austin Peay or a Florida Gulf Coast. That just shouldn't happen. So again, maybe one of those teams is better than I'm expecting. I'm not giving them enough credit, but that's a schedule where I see Tennessee maybe losing 2 of those games, and I think Tennessee should be able to enter SEC play, having played some good teams, but also with a pretty decent record, and maybe a top 15, maybe top 10 team heading into SEC play. According, again, assuming everyone's healthy and everything like that. But I think expectations for this year is Tennessee being a top 15, possibly a top 10 team. I don't know that's going to happen. I wouldn't put them in top 10, but I think Tennessee is going to be a preseason top 15 team by most places. And I think they'll be right around there again, as long as they stay healthy and things go where they're expecting. They should be right around that same mark, if not a little higher than that, by the time they get into SEC play, looking at who they're playing here in the non-conference.
All right, so Tennessee Tech just struggled to keep players. I think one of their better, if not, they're 2 starting guards. One of them is a kid from Chattanooga. I think he's at Tennessee State now. He grad transferred to Tennessee State, and he was like a 1,500 point, 500 assist guy or something like that. Another guard, I think, went to Belmont, maybe. So they lost both of their starting guards from last year. Florida Gulf Coast, brand new head coach. McNeese State's second-year head coach from a team that went 11-22 last year. Alcorn State, I never have high expectations unless Steve McNair is playing, um, which obviously can't happen now. Eastern Kentucky has struggled to be competitive. I think they're on like year 3 or 4 of a new coach. So none of those are games that should be relatively close. Like one thing I remember last year was that prior to the Arizona game, the Tennessee schedule, if I recall, kind of ramped up as the non-conference went on. That in that early going, a lot of people were getting really excited about the program because they were just thinking, because they're seeing all these shots made and stuff. And then I just kept saying, like, Standard is not this random mid-level team. Standard is not. And, there were some struggles. I think they scored 40 points against Texas Tech or something like that.
Barely.
They had struggles when they got into it. And obviously they figured a lot of that stuff out, even with injuries and stuff. They figured a lot of that stuff out over the course of the season, where they were like a really competitive team at the end. But it's an interesting non-conference game. I'll say that much because I don't know what to expect. I don't have a clue how to really look at it because, none of the home games should be considered challenges, true home games. Like Austin P, I think, just lost one of their assistant coaches to YouTube. And so, I'm looking at that and I'm just like, yeah, it's not the most appetizing non-conference schedule in terms of home games, but usually the SEC has a way of making it. I don't know how good the SEC is going to be this year, but the SEC has a way of making up for what could be considered a lack of quality home opponents. Not many teams always get the high-profile home games. In Kentucky, playing in Gonzaga and a small venue somewhere.
I want to say they are playing them. I forget where, but yeah, I think you're right.
I know they're playing this. I feel like maybe it's I could be way off here, but I feel like not everybody's going to get that overly appetizing game that everybody wants to see. It's oh man, this is the one. This is the one. It's not always going to happen. And this year is okay. They're playing at Gonzaga. So that's what
okay.
But Kentucky, I don't necessarily recall them having a huge history of just high-profile non-conference home games. I just don't. High-profile games in the non-conference, yeah. They always seem to be neutral site, like Duke, Carolina, Michigan State, teams like that. They always, seem to be neutral site games. And so it's okay that, Tennessee's schedule, their home schedules is just call it what it is. It's cupcake. But the rest of their schedule will make up for that. I can't speak to. I'd have to see a little bit more, and I understand it's a fun thought experiment for a lot of people, but I can't wrap my mind around wins and losses and records. They should win all their home games. That much we can all say. We can all agree that they shall always be blowouts, and Gene Henley and Nathanael Rutherford should average 5 points a game in those games because everybody should play in those games. Maybe there'll be a game that challenges them a little bit, like UT Barton last year challenged them a little bit early. Now, obviously, they blew it away, but there's going to be a game, one of those teams, that pushes you some, but at the end of the day, like, they're not anything that you get concerned about. But what they will do, what they should do, especially with trying to mesh some bodies together for, trying to mesh these rotations, figure out what works best. It gives you plenty of opportunities to work on this. Like you got plenty of chances to figure out what rotations you're going to
Mm-hmm.
go with. Because before you play Butler, you've got two kind of layup games and a game against Colorado that it's not a layup, but it's not the level of the other teams that you're playing. Um, you get back from the Bahamas, you got McNeese, Alcorn, and Eastern Kentucky before you then turn around and play Maryland and Arizona. Three more chances to figure out that rotation. So it actually stacks itself out pretty nicely. Like I said, it's just not appealing and appetizing for the games.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's you had to me. It's kind of an ideal, not for fans. It kind of sucks for fans, like you said. There's just not anything on the home slate that really attracts you. But it's been true for a lot of non-conference men's basketball or non-conference basketball. Well, I take it back. Lady Vols have had some really good home games the last few years. But most of the time for Tennessee, like non-conference men's basketball, you don't really have a ton of like home and home series. I think you may have just said that too. It's built a lot more on the neutral site stuff, even more so than football has kind of done over the last few years. Where at least football, you still have look at Tennessee and Pitt, for example. That's home and home. Oklahoma and Tennessee was home and home a few years ago. You still have those neutral site games like Tennessee and West Virginia that was in Charlotte, Tennessee and Georgia Tech that played in. It was neutral site, but it was in Georgia, closer to Tech than Tennessee, I think. But in men's basketball, like most of the big time non-conference stuff is neutral site. You said Duke and North Carolina, like especially those two teams. Duke for the longest time, especially under Coach K, refused to play any big time team outside of it was less as neutral site. They wouldn't play anyone on the road. I don't know if that'll change now that Coach K isn't there, but a lot of times it's those early season tournaments or at an interesting venue like you had the game that was played on the aircraft carrier. Like a lot of times the non-conference schedule to me is rarely a big appeal for men's basketball. I mean, look at last year you had Arizona. I think that was it though. I mean, I'm struggling. I'll have to go back and look at the schedule, but I don't know that there was another like big appealing home game for Tennessee last year that wasn't an SEC game besides the Arizona game. COVID was a little different. That was just a schedule changing kind of sometimes as the week happened. Schedules would change, but unless it's a Memphis, like even the times you've played Memphis, like that's kind of been the one game. Like you've had that and some pretty decent mid-major teams, but you don't have the times Tennessee's played Purdue have all been neutral site. Tennessee played Kansas at home and when they beat them when they're number one, but most of the time when Tennessee's played Kansas recently, it's been neutral site. When they played Gonzaga, it was neutral site. When they played, I mentioned Purdue, it was neutral site. Villanova, I think actually they played North Carolina, but they've played again. They've played North Carolina at home, but that's kind of like the one time. Like you have one big marquee home game that's not a non-conference game. That's kind of it. And this year it's Texas. You don't have one that's in early part of the year, which that's the thing that to me that sucks is you don't have one that's in November or December. That's the bummer. You don't have one that's going to get you excited in Thompson Bowling in November or December. You got to wait till January. By then you're already in SEC play. So. It stinks for fans, but my point was that this maybe is kind of the ideal non-conference slate for a team because you got some easy wins on there, like you said, to kind of figure out rotations and figure out, okay, this guy, how can we use him? Can he be counted on? What are his skills? What are, does he do differently in games than he does in practice? You have a lot of those games, hopefully, for Tennessee that you can do that with. Then you have enough tough teams and enough really good teams, and they're sprinkled in that you're going to be tested before you get into SEC play. So I think, for fans, it is not a very good slate of games for at least in Knoxville for Tennessee fans. But for the actual figuring things out for the team, I think this is really good. You're not super, super young where you need to figure out a bunch of stuff very quickly with a lot of young guys, but you are fairly new in a lot of areas. You have a lot of new guys, but you also have, like you mentioned, Gene, a really good core. Vescovy of James, they're returning. Camwa is healthy, and he's a guy who's been here. This is his fourth year. Ziegler, his second year, but he's still, he's part of the core, I think, for especially, returning from last year. That's one of the four main guys from last season. You have a lot but you have a lot you still got to figure out. How does Tyreek Key fit in? How does Julian Phillips fit in? What can he do? What can he bring to the team? And his, as a freshman, as a highly regarded player, you need to figure out the post situation. You have Cam always healthy, but how many minutes do you really want him to play? Can Urosh give you even just a little bit more than he did last year? What do you have in some of the new guys there? What can A do? Can he take another step forward? So you have questions you need answered. So I think you're right. Like, you have plenty of times and tests. You have plenty of games you can do that with, but you have just enough sprinkling of tests, I would say, on the non-conference docket that should give you plenty of opportunity to find more out about yourself in November and December, getting into SEC play. So yeah, I think it'll be a record that Tennessee fans will like, beside the team name on the TV on ESPN or on SEC Network. When Tennessee enters SEC play, it's a record that could be 10 wins, maybe 11 wins by that point, when you get into January and into SEC play. But we'll see kind of what happens. I just thought it was interesting that we have that now. We know, again, we should be getting the full schedule sometime soon. We now have the full dates and stuff like that for all of the non-conference games. We know who Tennessee's SEC opponents are and who they're playing on the road and at home and stuff. We just don't have the dates for those yet, but now that we have the dates for non-conference, I imagine we'll get the dates for the SEC games pretty soon, and at that point, we'll have the full schedule for the 22-23 season. So that's exciting. It always starts feeling a little more real to me when we get the actual full schedule and know, okay, these games, this is who Tennessee plays and when they play them on the schedule. And then that's kind of when the projections and like predictions start coming in of, okay, well, I thought they could beat this team, but now this team is sandwiched in between a road trip here, and this is they play this team after playing 3 ranked opponents in a row. This is going to be a tougher game than I thought. So like it's to me, this is when the projection season starts coming. Is here fairly soon. Kind of, I know right now it's football. That's the dominant thing in college athletics right now is football because we're in early mid-August, so it should be. We're in fall camp mode for every team out there. But for us basketball junkies, getting close to the time I'm starting to really start getting more excited about basketball is kind of, I guess, late August, early September, because that's when we start, again, having more projections. It's getting closer to when the team is all on campus now, because UT is starting soon if classes haven't already started for UT. But they'll all be kind of together on campus and stuff and start practicing sometime here fairly soon. So, Gene, I'm getting into football fan mode, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm pretty excited about basketball and already looking forward to it. But this was a really good episode, in my opinion, my humble opinion, who was part of the team that recorded it. But Gene, I want to say thank you, man. This was good. I'm enjoying having you back the last couple weeks. I really just enjoy talking basketball with you. You're the person who I think probably enjoy talking basketball with the most. So before we get into here, I just want to say thanks, man. It's been nice having you back.
Appreciate it, and certainly glad to be back. Busy summer, a lot of different things going on, and so obviously anybody that's watching this on YouTube and sees my son in the background. So we're working on decisions and opportunities, and so it was a lot of travel this summer. So like I said, certainly glad to be back and kind of just trying to get locked in again.
Well, thank you, Gene, and thank you to everyone who watched or listened to this episode, however you did it. Again, YouTube or the podcast, really appreciate everyone's support. Subscribe to the channel on YouTube if you haven't, or subscribe to the podcast if you haven't. Leave us a nice 5-star review if you haven't, also on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Would definitely appreciate that. Signing off for Gene, I am Nathanael, and this has been another episode of Vol Basketball Fever. Thank you for watching Vol Basketball Fever. Give this video a like and subscribe to the channel while you're here. We appreciate all your support, and the show wouldn't be possible without Vol fans like you. Thank you.